evening, everyone, and welcome to Black Literature, Black History. This is Jason Williams, and tonight we're going to be looking at the book Infants of the Spring by Wallace Thurman, written in 1932. Now, at the beginning of this book, as soon as you begin reading it and you get into the setting, you realize that Wallace Thurman calls the apartment that they're living in the Niggerati Manor. Now, we should be familiar with the term Niggerati because when we read Langston Hughes's first autobiography, The Big C, he explained to us that the group of writers that he used to run with, Wallace Thurman, Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, among others. Those are the three main that I always mention because they're a group of writers, artists, and poets. And I've never really indulged in the poetry and the artists, but there was a group of writers. They called themselves the Niggerati, which is a play on the term the Harlem Literati, because they were into the literature and art. And so Wallace Thurman calls this place where they live Niggerati Manor. And the characters in this book, Infants of the Spring, are images and references to the people who were actually part of the Niggerati. Langston Hughes said in his first autobiography, The Big C, that Infants of the Spring was for him the greatest demonstration or the greatest writing to explain what was going on in the 1920s and the 1930s as far as the Harlem Renaissance. Now, this book was written in 1932, so it's, it has some elements leading up into the 1930s. But this is a book of conversations. I'm still in the beginning of this book, but there's conversations taking place in this book, which I find fascinating because they're conversations that we still have today. And these conversations take place just between the characters. There's not much action going on, but the action is in the conversations. Because these artists, these writers, and these poets, they consider themselves intellectuals, and there's a lot of conversations that go on in this book. And there's so just getting into it, at the beginning of the book, they introduce two white characters. I mean, there's black characters, and we'll get into them, but there's two white characters. And the reason why I'm going to focus on them first is to tell you the conversations that take place about these two characters. So there's two characters, Samuel, who considers himself a radical American white person, and Stephen, his friend, which he introduces to his black literary friends, and he's from Denmark. And I find it interesting that Wallace Thurman has Stephen coming from Denmark, because in Nella Larsen's book Quicksand, Denmark is Quicksand is a book about passing, and Denmark is one of the origins or one of the settings that is mentioned in Quicksand, and that's a very good book that I recommend. But so Stephen is from Denmark, and once Samuel introduces Stephen to his friends, as the book goes along, Stephen decides to move in to Harlem with this literary group. And Samuel, he doesn't agree with this, and he has a conversation with Stephen about moving in with these black people. And Stephen tells Samuel that you have misgivings about me moving in with these black people because as an American and as a white American, you've grown up with these prejudices that are instilled in you, as much as you want to be a radical, or as much as you want to embrace them, you still have these prejudices in you towards these black people for the simple reason because they're black. And that's why you have a problem. I'm from Denmark. So Stephen explains to Samuel that he's not American, he's from Denmark. And Denmark doesn't have the same discourse as the US. So where Sam is hanging with these black people and introducing Stephen to these black people, he still has reservations due to American discourse and the society that he grew up in against black people, which leads to a discussion that Wallace Thurman brings up with the character Samuel. There's on chapter 2, he talks about Samuel's background. And Samuel is kind of a dangerous person to have in movements because Samuel was brought up conservative. And he goes to college, and then he idolizes the radicals, the radical ideals, and he himself wants to become a martyr for the radical causes in America. So he joins all these radical movements that were going on in the US, especially in the 1930s. You know, his book was written in 1932. And during this time period, there were a lot of communist causes, socialist causes, and America was still forming and going through changes. So Samuel embraces all these ideals intellectually, but when he joins these organizations and stuff, he finds that he's not put in the forefront of any movements. He becomes an errand boy. He carries banners. He's in the background, and he's not a leader or a martyr. So what he does in order to gain status is that he joins movements and he joins causes for black people. Now he notices in the black community there was a lot of black people who embrace him, put him in the forefront, give him praises, and give him all the things that he was looking for in the other radical movements just because he's white. And we see that happen a lot in the US. Like a white person does something that black people usually enjoy, or a white person does something and then black people like lose their head over it. For example, when Tommy Loren did that one little rap verse in the video, there was all kind of tweets and all kind of social media about how great she is and how cool she is and everything with the black community just because of that little thing. So like when a white person does something in the black community or does something that black people can relate to, they put them all the way up on the pedestal just because they're white. And that's what Samuel found when he joined the black community. But Samuel came to the realization, even though he's still hangs around the black community, that he, and this is in the description, in his background, that he enjoys capitalism and he's just a very conservative person in his beliefs. And the ideals that uphold conservatism are the ones that he actually embraces regardless of what he intellectually thinks or what he wishes that he could believe in. And in looking at the black community, people should realize that the black community is a very conservative community. Now, when you read these books, these are artists and, you know, literary people, you know, they're radical in their ways of thinking. But if you go into the black community you'll find that the black community has a lot of very conservative ideals. And the LGBTQ community encountered this when they were having their movements, and they were enlisting like the ranks of the black community, and found out that the black community wasn't very supportive of what they were going for, because the LGBTQ community and those and like gay and lesbianism and things like that in that community are not very widely accepted in the black community. And they tried to liken their cause with the civil rights movement, but they found out that black people weren't agreeing with that link that they were trying to put together. They're like, wait a minute, we were fighting for our cause because we're black and our skin was black and they're discriminating against us. That's not the same thing as you fighting for rights to do things because you're a homosexual. There is a difference, because people can't look at you and tell that you're a homosexual. That's something that you reveal or they come to notice, but they can't just look at you. It's different when someone looks at you and you're black. Because you're black when you're a child, you're black when you're a teenager, you're black when you're an adult. You know, sexuality is something that develops and changes over time. Like, well, I don't know if it changes over time. I don't want to say that, but you know, people come out of the closet and reveal it. It's not the same thing as race, but I'm not an expert on the LGBTQ community, so I don't want to go real deep into that conversation. However, the question of the LGBTQ community does come up, because Wallace Thurman and other writers during this period, they were homosexuals and lesbians and bisexuals. And it's really interesting that in 1932, Wallace Thurman brings up a conversation, and I just want to read it to you, where I believe Stephen is talking with one of them, and he asked this question. No, it was Samuel. Samuel asked one of them this question, and I just want to read it because it's very interesting. Because in 1932, you'll find that many of the writings during this period were very masculine. Unless you're reading stories or literature written by a woman, much of the literature that the men wrote are very masculine. If you read Langston Hughes' autobiographies, they're very masculine. So Samuel asks, I believe the character name is Paul, but he asks him this question. Did you ever have an affair with a woman? Because they all know that Paul is gay, but he's actually a bisexual. So he said, did you ever have an affair with a woman? Certainly. Did you ever, he lowered his voice, indulge in homosexuality? Certainly. Samuel turned red. The others in the room tried no longer to restrain their laughter. It seemed as if the pursued was about to elude the pursuer once and for all. But Samuel was primed for the chase. Which did you prefer? He smiled to himself. Now he had him. Surrender was inevitable. His eyes prematurely evinced the light of victory. Prematurely, because Paul found the one available loophole. With a toss of his head, he quickly replied, I don't really know. After all, there are no sexes, only sex majorities, and the primary function of the sex act is enjoyment. Therefore, I enjoyed one experience as much as the other. When the laughter subsided, Pelham passed another round of drinks. So it's funny that he just, Wallace Thurman is gay, and he brings up that aspect. He brings up a gay experience in the blacker the berry, and then he brings it up here. And it goes throughout this book because the people in his community, the one in his society, you know, that's what they did. So he just brings it out in 1932. Now, the drinking. Now, I noticed that Langston Hughes really enjoyed this book. And one of his causes, and what a lot of the, I guess, the Boule Negroes frowned upon him and these writers, is because they showed very dark aspects and very negative aspects of the black community. They also showed some good ones, but they also showed some bad ones. And when you're reading this book, you'll find a lot of sex going on, a lot of drunkenness going on, a lot of drinking going on, and it's a whole bunch of irresponsible acts and things going on with this group of artists. Like, some of them don't pay the rent, and there's some economic conversations that go on because they're like, I really like the art, I really like the lifestyle of being an artist, but there's no money coming in a lot of times when you live that lifestyle. And then there's a conversation that comes up like, what do you prefer, this or that? Or who do you need more in your community, this type of person or that type of person? And Raymond, one of the characters in this book, he's the main character. Like, he has a preference for the artistic side over the money side, even though these artists that he wants to support aren't making enough money to get the rent paid. So that's a problem. Okay, and another conversation that comes up is one of the characters, his name is Bull, and he gets really drunk and he attacks Stephen in an episode. In one of the chapters, he attacks Stephen because Stephen is interacting romantically with a black woman. And Bull gets really upset and attacks him because he doesn't want Stephen to have any black women because it's prohibitive for black men to have white women in that period. Like, during this period, black men were getting hung and accused of rape and everything. And they were, like, white women were something that they just were not supposed to have. So when Bull, being drunk, sees Stephen with this black woman, he attacks him. And there's not a fight, but he attacks him. He's drunk and he falls over and he rants and raves. And then when he's not drunk, there's a conversation that he has on what his answer and what his goal in life is. And there's a lot of black people nowadays that think like this because I've heard people say it before. So I'm going to read it to you. Okay. I'm a man. This is Bull talking. I'm a man and I expect to be a man among men. Now maybe I was in the wrong last night. I'm so goddamn bullheaded when I get drunk, but you see, and here he looked directly at Stephen. I ain't used to seeing no white man with no colored woman. The bastards lynch every nigger that has a white woman, and I kind of thinks darkies ought to do the same. But you see, Steve, a note of tenderness crept into his harsh voice. I forgot you wasn't no ordinary white man, and he paused to gulp down another glass of gin. I'm sorry. It's all right, Boo. Stephen could think of nothing else to say. Raymond and Paul exchanged amused glances. Eustace glided around the room, swishing his green dressing gown, refilling the empty glasses. Meanwhile, Boo began orating on race relations. Now, this part is interesting. It was impossible for anyone else to get in a word. An uncle of his, it seemed, had been lynched on suspicion of having raped a white woman. Although a mere adolescent at the time, Boo had sworn to avenge his kinsman's death by, and it says ... And in his own words, having every white woman I can get, and by hurting any white man I can. I hates the bastards, I gets drunk so I can beat them up, and I likes to make their women suffer. But if I ever catch one of the son of the bitches messing around with one of my women, hell's doors won't open quick enough to catch them. Raymond felt that he should say something, should perhaps advance an argument to contravene Boole's point of view, but he realized that it was futile. So it's funny, these conversations that they have. And there's more conversations later. I was going to wait to do this video because there's another conversation that comes up where Wallace Thurman talks about what happens when a white woman comes into the black community and has sexual or romantic relationships with black men. And when that comes up, when I get to it in the book, then I'll do another video and we'll talk about that, because these are conversations that we're still having today, and it's just fascinating. Like, if people would read all of these books, then the conversations that we have today on these subjects wouldn't be repeating the same subjects or the same themes over and over again. I mean, this was in 1932, it's 2018, and not everyone is having these conversations, but a lot of times when people talk about race relations on a layman's level, not in the classrooms, not in the graduate level and things like that, but when you're just around talking with your friends and stuff like this, these themes keep coming up and you hear the same arguments going on over and over and over again. And once you read these books, it's hard to continue to have these conversations with your friends, because you say one thing and you want to get past it, but they're still on it because they haven't read these books, they haven't had these experiences, and to them it's you bringing up new ideas, but to you it's like, this has already been talked about. It's been talked about, there's been solutions, or there hasn't been any solutions, it's time to move on. But they're still in the stage of experiencing these new conversations. So, Infants of the Spring, Wallace Thurman, I really recommend this book, and we're going to continue with this. And after I get done with Wallace Thurman, I'm going to move into slavery, because I've been finding that there's a lot of questions and a lot of controversy concerning how slavery began, what really happened with slavery, and I really want to get into that. I wanted to get into that after I did Langston Hughes. That was my idea, but you can see how literature is. One thing leads to the next, leads to the next. So we're going to finish Wallace Thurman, jump into slavery, jump into the slave narratives, so we can get the actual information from the slaves themselves, because they wrote it down and we should read it. And then we'll come back to the 1930s, because there's a lot of authors and there's a lot of material that we haven't covered even when we finish with Wallace Thurman. Again, this is Black Literature, Black History, Jason Williams. Have a nice evening.